Great. So we have about 25 minutes for questions, and we're happy to take questions too from you all. There are a couple of microphones there, and we need to take them from the microphones because it's being recorded. I think I'll start while people are going to the mics. So Donna, you had us thinking. So in that, all of you raised issues about the lack of human-centered design, right? So we never really designed trials previously around the needs of the person, in this case the participant, and instead we've designed them based on tradition and provider needs, and those really have been guiding forces. And it's interesting to think that actually that's true for healthcare in general as well, right? Healthcare is hardly human-centered. The hospital gown, average, waiting rooms, so 40-minute waiting rooms being typical, lack of communication by email and accepting that as a norm are three, obvious examples. Is this, are the trials a victim of a broken healthcare system? And if so, fundamentally, that could be the way the professionals approach it. It's probably, that financial incentives are not the same, so it's not quite that. But I'm just curious to hear you all's thinking about that, and how do we overcome that?
I think it's building on top of a broken system, but because it does have its own financial stream and workforce, it really can take its own, take its own stream, and I think it maybe have an influence on changing how healthcare can also be delivered. I think the point that Craig made about being having a complement for treating physicians is so profound. Because I think patients and their treating physicians are really in this together, and the current research system isn't designed either for them either. And I think that's one of the key barriers for participation, either because they're thinking about losing a patient, so they don't even tell the patient that a trial is available, or even if a patient is interested, they can't get records, and they need the participation of their physician. You also limit access because a lot of minority treating physicians aren't set up with all the paperwork and infrastructure for traditional clinical trials, and to be able to access those physicians and their patients better, we need to be thoughtful of their workflow and life flow. So I think that because of the incentives, the sort of time-constrained incentives in drug development, I think there's an incredible opportunity to showcase use of these technologies with patients. I'm talking with companies right now in the diagnostic space about how things they've been doing in some of the liver trials, where they're now have these great technologies in centers around the country. I'm like, well, can we start using them in care? And it seemed like such an odd question for them, like, well, we had never thought about that. And so making that, how can we use that for care? So I think your question is such a great one, because I think a lot of the things that we're learning and able to do, and the expectations that we can create with study participants and how they receive the rest of the care can drive healthcare transformation.
So in the 1930s, 40% of patient-physician encounters, 40% occurred in the home. So that's the definition of patient-centered care, as a doctor coming to see you on your terms in your environment. So what happened? Advances in transportation, roads, and cars became available, and advances in diagnostic testing, X-rays, ECGs, blood work, fueled the drive to providing care institutions. So 2018, we have the internet, which allows us to connect people back to individuals in their home, and we have increasingly ECGs, X-rays, blood work, IV infusions that can all be done in the home. So we increasingly have the means, as Craig was mentioning, to deliver care and deliver research opportunities to participants. We've just failed to act.
Great. Good. Can you all introduce yourselves too when you...
Steve Cummings. I talk next. So a little slightly different perspective. I was asked to spend a year and a half at Genentech, Roche, to try to help them make their trials far more efficient, and came to it with the idea that we would make them virtual. And that's one of the ways of reaching the efficiencies. But they developed products for inflammatory diseases and for cancer and for a range of things, for uncommon diseases, for example, where it really is required that the patient be seen, recruited in a specialty clinical site, and seen with sometimes intensive examinations or the administration of antibodies. That needed to be monitored. And so in the 12 trials that we reviewed, I didn't see any that can be converted to a siteless trial. Many things could have been done, some things could have been done at home, and some things could have been done, with reports using a mobile device. But the greatest efficiencies, where we cut somewhere between 20 and 80% of the number of assessments from these phase 3 and phase 4 trials, came from simply not doing the visits. We found that, if you applied just simple principles of clinical research design, the number of assessments you need over the course of the trial to achieve your aims was, sometimes just a small part of the number that were planned and baked into the protocol. So one patient-centered thing to do is to simplify the protocols and simplify and just not do some of the visits rather than substituting another home visit for it.
Thank you, Steve. Adrian?
Adrian Hernandez from Duke, and thanks a lot for these interesting presentations. And Ray, I was struck by your example of the financial industry and how everyone uses apps for checking on their money, paying bills, et cetera. I guess one question is, what's the incentive structure for participants to continue that engagement? So, it's obvious for financial apps because there's money. And they're using money to do something and hopefully getting more information about how their money's being spent. But for those who are participating in virtual studies, sometimes it's not quite clear what's the incentive structure that would be a similar model. And I'd be interested in the others.
I think it might depend on the condition, and Donna and Craig might have additional thoughts. For Parkinson's, I think the vast majority of people want to participate in research. I think the vast majority of people with bad diseases want to learn more and contribute.
Well, I guess maybe to clarify, so the continued engagement, because it's, people can sign up for apps all the time. So how do you keep people in? What's the incentive structure to keep them in?
So I think it depends on the study. We were involved in Apple's Research Kit, and we saw an exponential decline in our use of the app, and every app manufacturer experiences the same exponential decline in usage. I think you have to find ways to make it engaging. For ours, we gave people back real-time data on how they were doing. You could see how they were doing and how they were maybe in the future, how they're comparing to other people like them, how they're likely to, their outcomes will be, and predict what their outcomes will be like in the future. I think those types of things will be valuable. I think for some of these clinical observational studies where actually you're connecting to people in their home, they generally like talking to researchers and like the interaction, and generally we're friendly people. And they're very vested in it. So I think for some studies, especially that are more around high touch, people get really vested in those conditions and want to contribute. For smartphones and some of these digital tools where engagement is problematic, independent of the aims of whether it's for commercial purposes or research purposes, I think it's more challenging. You have to find ways that make it valuable for the participants instead of you just extracting data from them, that there's some value to them back. One big thing is, can they get their own data? Can they see how they're doing compared to other people like them? How they're comparing to other 50-year-olds with Parkinson's disease? Can they get information back if exercise is helping them, or those types of things?
I'm Nitin Desai. I'm Chief Medical Officer of HealthWinds. Go ahead.
I just want to add one thing on Adrian's comment.
Sure.
Sorry. I think we have to stratify first observational and interventional clinical trials in terms of those incentives to remain, not only because the incentives are very different. If somebody is in an interventional clinical trial, obviously there are reasons why they're going that route. But we're also somewhat limited in terms of some of the other strategies we can use, some of the other countermeasures we can use. I think for observational research, it can make a lot of sense to get data back to people as temporally meaningfully as possible. That's hard to do in a blinded randomized clinical trial and takes far more forethought and planning in terms of what data can you return and when to try to keep people engaged. So I can empathize that there are different strategies that may be needed, but it may be different pressures based on observational versus interventional research.
I also think that the other point of sort of differentiation is between, patients whose diseases, they are dealing with them, managing them with obvious, symptoms or implications on a daily basis, versus maybe some cardiovascular disease trial where the symptoms may be sort of silent and it's longer term. And so I think for patients who are used to sort of interacting with their data or their symptoms on a daily basis, you should be able to see, even if you're not giving them back their data, being able to give them, useful hints or facts or other patient strategies, and just really sort of checking in so that there is that conversation, that dialogue, and some element of gamification, for them. And I think for those who, otherwise could live their life, if they weren't in this trial, their disease may not be giving them reasons to interact with their medical record or data on a daily basis. I think then you need to be, much more creative and reach out much more frequently to have them, interact with the various tools. But for people whose conditions have them interacting with their records, and I think that rather than lumping all patients together, but really thinking in terms of different ways of segmenting them by psychographics and demographics and what they're going through for their conditions, you can, to the point of human-centered design, you can really design a retention strategy for the trial that is more fulfilling for them.
So I'm Nitin Desai, I'm Chief Medical Officer of Healthways. Steve kind of stole part of my question. It is on patient engagement. We have about 40 million uninsured Americans. We have millions of participants that we need for clinical trials. We have these huge data silos in EHR with health systems and clinical softwares and doctors' offices, and somehow we are not connecting the dots. I think the missing piece, one of the missing pieces, is patient engagement for recruitment and retention in the trial. We need to leverage some better ethical and legal barriers, I think. Those barriers need to overcome to get the patients in. We have millions of patients out there. And there is a lot of money out there to be funneled into clinical research for the right reason, but we are just not connecting. So it's just a question to the panel. What do you see in terms of ethical and legal barriers uplifting in near future?
Quite honestly, I wish my biggest challenge were patient retention, because that would mean at least I was able to find and get them engaged. I think even upstream of your question is awareness. And I think that's, quite honestly, our biggest challenge when it comes to large numbers of patients. Research literacy is low, awareness of trials is low, and awareness with how to engage with a trial is not only low, but it's also hard. Mm-hmm. They can't go to their treating physicians in most cases to find out about clinical trial opportunities. The only way that's going to work is if your treating physician, by some happenstance, happen to be the investigator in a given trial. But for the most part, the ability to connect with a trial that way is very hard. I think we need approaches like virtual trials that can make studies more accessible, but it's not going to work in a vacuum. New channels like social are great, and I think that in some disease areas can be tremendous enablers of improving awareness of trial participation. But I don't know if it's going to be enough. And then I think we can start to fret a bit more of the engagement opportunities downstream, which piggyback really nicely on the question Donna answered earlier about designing clinical trials for humans rather than simply designing clinical trials to collect data. And that's a difference that I think many research sponsors are traveling down, but they're still in a nascent stage. We're in the valley of the blind where one-eyed man is king, and we think, oh, we're engaging patients, this is great, but we're hardly doing it at the right level. Thank you.
You know, I think about how many people cast votes for The Voice. And simply, they're clearly doing something that's engaging. They're reaching millions of people of all walks of life, and getting them to learn more and to take an action, and to even research candidates and things like that. And so I think it has implications as much for research as it does for some of our civic engagement. You know, the number one predictor of whether a person will participate in a clinical trial is if their doctor recommends it, whether the person brings it up to their doctor and the doctor says, yes, that's a good thing to do, or if their doctor, and I know it's rare, actually brings that to them. And that's not being done for a variety of reasons. Even as a leader of a patient advocacy organization where we think clinical trial participation is very important, and we put out information on different trials. Talking with the leaders of several different advocacy organizations, I just asked the rhetorical question, if we added up how much money patient advocacy organizations have had to spend on matching services to overlay clinicaltrials.gov, which is, supposed to be a public resource, I know not created, talking about fit for purpose, but not created for the purpose of actually engaging with people to find the trials that they might want to enroll in. But what if it were? What if this big sort of public resource really were repurposed to help people learn about trials, learn from other people who have been in trials, so it's a little less scary. Think about not only where are trials close to them, but how can we make trials that integrate into their lives and easy to participate in, and don't make them have to understand really obscure medical terminology to be able to find a trial opportunity that might work for them. So that has been on my wish list for a while.
Almost sounds like we need to add another slide into the virtual trial to include and incentivize the physicians somehow. What's the motivation might be just to get out of boredom of HMO, I don't know. But that could be an angle that we need to consider. How do we get physicians motivated to be part of a clinical trial virtually without doing 100% one-site traditional way trials have been conducted? Thank you.
It's an interesting point that you made about clinicaltrials.gov, because that's another thing that we can do virtually better than we do currently, and link those sorts of things, right? So currently, too, if you have an interest, you can go down this long list at the bottom and see what the site is and call a number, and maybe they'll call you. But it's horribly non-user friendly. If you had to do that to buy a new TV monitor, you'd never buy that monitor. So it is interesting. The virtualization actually creates platform opportunities as well that could impact the entire field.
Hi, Sally Oken from Patients Like Me. Great panel. Thank you for your comments. I'm interested in thinking about a challenge that I am coming up against frequently because I'm involved in a number of different consortiums and initiatives around the use of real-world data. And the use of real-world data today is typically being seen as information that's gathered from claims or from EHRs. But as all of us know and agree, I think, there's lots of data that's being generated from our Fitbits and other things. And the idea of doing virtual trials will heavily depend on the kinds of data from those sorts of sensors. So I think while, Craig, you mentioned that there isn't any regulation against us using these kinds of technologies, I think we do run into a barrier in the regulatory use of the data that's generated from some of these devices currently. And so I think we're moving closer to getting out of that nascent experience to something where the FDA is more and more interested in trying to figure out ways to do this. But it still is a challenge and I think a barrier as we start to try to think about normalizing or standardizing some of the data generated from some of the devices that we might might be using in virtual trials. So I see it as a challenge that we didn't speak about too much in your talk. Maybe it'll be in another panel, but it does feel to me that there's lots of conversations around real-world data moving to real-world evidence, but much of that conversation is not about sensors or person-generated data. It's about EHR and claims data. So we have, I think, still a long way to go.
Well, I think, Sally, it's a great point, and I think it gets to that core that very quickly the lack of reliable and stable digital biomarkers is going to become our rate limiter, whether that's sourced from provisioned research-grade devices or from consumer-grade devices that are real-world evidence-generating, Fitbits and Apple Watches. I think that that's going to be our limiter very quickly. I do think, though, that there's real-world data and there's real-world data. And there's a very available use case of real-world data in the context of prospective virtual trials that doesn't require any additional regulatory permission slips. And that's when patients can bring their own EHR data into your study. And that is extremely powerful, that as recently as 2 years ago felt like a TED Talk, and today feels like, a native app on Apple Health. With the proliferation of FHIR and the number of tools that are increasingly available, it's just awesome today, the potential for patients being realized to bring their data into research studies. And that's, another use case around real world data that's a little easier than I want to make, new claims off of real world evidence on its own, which is absolutely a very challenging one.
So I would say claims and EHR data are not real world data. So we're completely in the dark about how our conditions affect patients. So in clinical care, I might see a patient with Parkinson's disease 4 times over a year. That would be a lot. That would mean 99.99% of the time I have no idea how that they're doing. I don't know how much time they're walking. I don't know how much time they're spending in their bed. I don't know how much time they're spending outside their home. I don't know how much time they're spending alone. We put wearable sensors on people with Huntington's disease, a rare genetic disorder. People coming into clinic over 48 hours when they went home, we found out they were in bed, lying down 50% of their day. None of my colleagues knew this. Been caring for people with Huntington's disease for 30, 40 years. 50% of their day lying down. When we're sick, we're not lying down 50% of the time. A recent clinical trial was done in congestive heart failure in which the primary outcome measure was accelerometry units, so measuring the amount of activity. Robert Temple from the FDA said, I'm not really sure what an accelerometry unit is, but it seems to be that a lot of face validity that people who are more active with congestive heart failure, that's a good thing. And he liked the idea about using real-world data and using these new tools to assess whether a drug or an intervention was beneficial. So I think, and Leonard Sachs is here from the FDA, my sense from seeing the FDA is that they're thirsty. Most of them are thirsty for these measures. We completely do not understand how people are how diseases are affecting them. Depression, we have depression scales that we have people fill out in the clinic. Pain, we have people circle happy faces after they've traveled 2 hours to come see us in clinic. Parkinson's disease, I have people tap their thumb and index finger, and we rate that on a categorical scale from 0 to 4. It's absurd that what we're doing in terms of measuring health, especially when we have these tools that can tell us how much time people are spending at home, how much time they're alone, how much they're walking, how many words they're speaking a day. There's tons of information that we have been unwilling and unable to capture on individuals. I'll find the last thing on the soapbox. I went to a presentation on Sky, the cycling team. Sky, the cycling team, these are people who are doing the Tour de France. They know more about the physiology of their cyclists than my entire field knows about the field of physiology of Parkinson's disease. It's absurd what we don't know and the amount of ignorance that we have and our unwillingness to address it.
Great. So Leonard is here and is going to be speaking tomorrow. We have other representatives from the FDA, so we can explore this notion of how important the FDA is a barrier to getting to moving things forward. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Emily Butler. I'm a statistician at GlaxoSmithKline. So as a statistician, the thing that's that's been the most intriguing to hear, especially with some of the group that I work on at my company and some of the work that I do, is endpoint selection, the difficulty and importance of endpoint selection, and this incredible rat race to collect as much data as possible without making sure that we're collecting good data and we're able to make something from the data. So the head of our R&D was talking to us yesterday, and he was saying that from his previous company, they went back and looked through how much data was looked at by a human being that was collected, and it was something like 10% of data that was collected, the file was never even opened. So I guess I was just curious if, personally, I think if we just all like stop and chill and like think a second instead of this rat race to trying to get to the commercial market as quick as possible, but what do I know? But I was wondering if you could talk to that endpoints and overuse of data without collecting data and then on the back end saying, okay, let's make something out of it, instead of stopping and saying, well, why don't we make sure that we collect data that will make sense at the end? If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I just I 2 points about sort of data curation and sort of data quality that hopefully will fit, and then I'll let Craig Rich give you the real answer. Because I'm a patient with several concurrent conditions and see a lot of ologists, I had to create sort of a curated list of, out of all the various labs and tests and things, like keep their eyes on the prize. There are really only 6 things that we need to look at to monitor that its movement matters. And so some of them are unfamiliar to some of the ologists. They don't use that in their particular specialty. And so listing the goal where they think that we're trying to get me, because often their care will impact that goal even if they're not the specialist. And refocusing on the 6 things that, on one page, that matter for my care really transformed. First of all, they had to recognize that they were working as a team and that I was a patient and all the parts talked to each other. But as we looked at these sort of 6 key elements that they all agreed to were the key elements, over time, we were really able to, keep our eyes on the prize and focus on how we could improve my care. So I think that there are some corollaries in terms of data creation and, and all the possible things that we could collect, what actually matters for the particular trial. And then in terms of data quality coming from the sort of the patient perspective, I'll just use weight. So I would submit that the weight I take, every morning under the same circumstances on my scale that is graphed is better than the weight I take, bring it 4 times a year, maybe after lunch, before lunch, wearing different clothes. It's winter now. I was, wearing a lot of heavy sweaters yesterday. Is much higher quality data on my weight than what goes into my medical record. And there are several different examples of that. So as we think about virtual trials and data quality, I think we need to be, we shouldn't assume that the patient-generated data is of inferior quality than that collected in the clinic.
Just on the weight, we didn't know about nocturnal hypo and hyperglycemia until we bothered to measure people's blood glucoses at night. In our field, we didn't know about sleep disorders until we bothered to watch people sleep. I mean, there's just immense knowledge that we don't know that's readily available to us that we fail to capture.
And of course, this all comes full circle back to the virtual trials topic, because people will use that complex visit schedule and the burden of data that they're collecting as the reason why they require a visit. And it goes back to the point Dr. Cummings was making earlier. I love Freakonomics, but and the idea here that sponsors pay more, patients are burdened more, it's more work for the site. So why would we do it, right? And it's because I think that fear of risk trumps economic theory, that people are so afraid that they will miss something that just keeps getting in their way. I think the other challenge that we see is to just keep adding, right? Yeah. I've got a new digital biomarker, great, throw it in. We've got another PRO, awesome, drop it right in there. And nothing gets taken out. There's no substitution. I think that for this future state of being able to fully leverage the digital biomarkers that are emerging today, we have to let go some of the things from the past and acknowledge that those were gold standards that did not earn the title of being called casting gold. We've got to let go of those endpoints. I guess my last comment on it, though, is one of timing. That when you think about the drug development process, very few companies are willing to invest early enough in validating a new biomarker on their own for it to be ready for a point when it will actually matter. You'd have to start validating that endpoint probably as soon as that molecule entered the clinic for it to be ready for you in a meaningful way in phase 3, and very few are willing to make that kind of investment. And so it's one more reason why the collaborations in this space are so vital and so critical for acceleration. Companies, I think, research sponsors need to make their own investments around digital biomarkers for sure, but very often it's going to only be carried forward because those collaborations persist outside of just the time cycle of a drug development program.
Okay, we have time for one quick question and response.
I'll try to make this quick. My name is John Birch. I'm with the Mid-America Angel, an investment group in Kansas City, although I'm here representing my own interests. I guess my question is this, or my comment first, is that the comment was made earlier about thinking, and I think we're thinking about this wrong. We're not looking at, this is a typical discussion of doctors talking about a problem that patients have. I'm being a little bit extreme here, but if we look at what patients do when they log on to WebMD, for example, we learn a lot about what patients are really interested in. Social media tells us a lot as well about what patients are, what kind of research they're interested in. Adrian raised the question earlier about what's going to be the patient engagement here, the patient retained engagement, and I think what we're not doing right here is we're not looking at this as a consumer product. That's precisely what it is. It's a series of consumer products, but it's a service relating to consumer products. What are the consumers' attitudes towards these things and towards their use for their own care, for their own interest, for their own wellness, as well as for science? I haven't seen those kinds of consumer research studies, to be honest. So that's a comment, but I hope a question.
I guess my short answer on this, my short reply would be, it's a product where 50% of the consumers get no value back whatsoever, and all they incur is burden. It's a product similar. I draw the analogy very often to the airline industry, because nobody, unless you're a masochist, nobody wants to be on an airplane. Nobody wants to go through TSA. Nobody wants to wait around in a terminal. You're only doing all of that to get to a certain destination. And I think a clinical trial is much the same. Nobody wants to be in this. Nobody is actively seeking one out. Nobody wants to download an app that helps them find clinical trials because they don't want to be in one. What they want is the outcome. They want to get to the destination. They want to feel better. And I think there's a lot we can learn from, I think, how the airline industry navigates in that space.
Well, great. Well, this has been a great conversation as we think about supersonic transport as a result of this meeting. I think a lot of the ideas that you all brought up will continue to come up. So thank you all very much.